Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books. Today I'm here with my final video recapping 2022 and the books I read in 2022 with the best fiction I read in 2022, not including romance because I did a separate video on my favorite romance novels of 2022. So if you didn't see that and would like to, I will link that down below. But other than romance, I didn't separate out the rest of my fiction reading because I do read quite widely within the fiction genre. And so actually in this video I do want to divide up some of these books into the middle grade books I really loved in 2022 and then the rest. So let's start with those. Let's start with the middle grade books that made the cut as my favorite books I read in 2022. So again, these are not books that necessarily were released last year, but it's just books I read last year. So first on my list is Bitten by Akwaeke and Emezi. I really love Emezi's writing. They are just such a fantastic writer. And Bitter is actually a prequel to Pet. So if you've read Pet, you will know kind of the backstory of the world it is set in. Bitter is set years before Pet, following the main character's mother when she was a teenager. And it really, I love the way Emezi engages with what it means to take action in active resistance against the state in the book, through the lens of a child. In this, like, the main character has been poor and has been trying to escape the violence and state repression, and so she finds a safe haven in an art school. As a result, she wants nothing to do with the protests and the violence happening on the streets. But as she forms relationships with the people around her, she realizes that there's no way to just not take action when something horrible is happening, but that there are different ways of being part of the resistance, of protesting, and it doesn't involve every single person being out on the streets, though it does require people being out on the streets. The book also talks about what it means to be an activist and the importance of self-care within activism. I loved all of those aspects. I found it just so deep and engaging. Fantastic book, highly recommended to readers of all ages. Next, I read Witchlings by Caribel Ortega. And Witchlings is the story of this young witch who, children in this world have to kind of pass a series of tests in order to be placed into their covens, and there are different covens with different specific characteristics, and our main character is just hoping to not be one of the spares, one of the people that cannot be placed into a coven. And guess what? She ends up being a spare, and then she ends up going on a quest with two other children to kind of forge a friendship, allow them to kind of close the coven circle and defeat a monster. It is so fantastic. The world building here, I just cannot wait to delve deeper into the story. Book number 2's already been announced, the cover is out, and I just cannot wait to read more in this world. The next book in the middle grade category that I thought was just really fantastic was Valentina Salazar is Not a Monster Hunter by Zoraida Cordova. I've really been loving Zoraida Cordova's writing, and this middle grade book was just kind of fun and also engaging in deeper issues. In this one, you follow Valentina, whose family has actually been fighting the trend of killing monsters. What they do is they go around finding these monsters and saving them, allowing them to go back to their world where they are safe and they are not like bad people. They just look like monsters in our world, and our world is not a safe place for them. And so she engages in that at the same time that her family is trying to step away from helping monsters because of a tragic accident that occurred. except it turns out that the tragic accident, like there's more to the tragic accident than was there. And I just love that. The book could have gone deeper on some of these themes, but I really liked some of the messaging here. I liked Valentina Salazar. She's a kick-ass, thoughtful, wonderful kid, and I loved seeing those dynamics in this book. Next book is Undercover Latina, which I think falls more into the YA category. This is by Aya de Leon, and this follows a young Afro-Latinx girl who is, her family is part of a secret organization that fights racism in the United States. And as part of that, she is tasked with the mission of befriending the son of a white supremacist. And that's all, like, this is supposed to be a safe mission. All she has to do is befriend this kid, and if the father has contact with the kid, let the organization know. That's it. Except, she ends up having to get much more involved than that and dealing with the issue of colorism, of what it means to be white passing in a family in which not everybody passes as white. I just found it to handle those topics really well and to still be a really engaging, really nice story overall. And then the only other young adult book I read that I really, really loved was Breathe and Count Back from 10 by Natalia Sylvester. This book just won a few ALA awards, and I can totally see why. Our main character suffers from a hip condition. I think it's hip dysplasia. That means she cannot engage in the world in the same way as other people because of her hip problem. However, swimming has been a great therapy for her, and her dream is to be a mermaid. She also comes from an immigrant family that is very still scared about their legal status in this country. And her parents are extremely fearful. Their fear guides a lot of the decisions that they make when it comes to what their daughters are allowed to do and not to do. I related so much with that. Like, so much. I cannot even tell you how personal that story hit me. And I have no experience with the kind of disability that the main character has in this book, but I still found that to be a great learning experience, seeing her struggle with that, and with being the oldest daughter in an immigrant family, trying to figure out how to follow her dreams and still, like, care for her family. That just hits so close to home, and I think that these are all books that I think, regardless of what your age is, that you would find something to like in all of them. So I think you should think about picking up one of these books, even if you're an adult reader. The next set of books are all adult books, but they range in terms of the genre they are in, and I'm just going to talk about them in the order in which I read them last year. So the first on the list is Severance by Ling Ma. So this was one of the first books I read in 2022, but it had such a profound effect on me that, like, I still remember this book vividly. It's set during a pandemic, and we're never told exactly, like, the specifics behind this pandemic, except that it turns people into kinds of zombies. Our main character doesn't have a very exciting life, and she feels like really not a meaningful life, and so during the pandemic she's in New York, and she ends up continuing to go to work. And she's one of the survivors, and so it's really, the book is a critique of a capitalist system, a system of, like, productivity, and having now lived through a pandemic, living in a pandemic, the book actually felt extremely realistic, and I appreciated so much the critique of our work culture in this capitalist system in the U.S. So I found it fantastic. People had problems with the ending of the story. I did not. Again, because it felt realistic to me, and I think maybe if I had read this book pre-pandemic, I would have felt very differently about it, but I think it captured a lot of the feeling of going through a pandemic. The next book on my list is Kim Jiyoung, born in 1982, by Nam-Joo. This is a fantastic book following, it's the story of a woman in South Korea and what it means to be a woman in a highly patriarchal society that has made progress in terms of women's rights, right? She has access to work, to a career she wants, but there's still very much that pressure of being a mother, being a wife, and how women who become mothers and wives, the restrictions they face and the discrimination they face in the workplace and the feeling, the way it affects a person's identity and their sense of self, and just like the profound effect it has on it. It's a very short book, but highly impactful. And even though it's set in North and South Korea, it felt so very true for the experience of women in other parts of the world. Like, I just felt there was a lot of connections there to the feelings a lot of women have in the United States and elsewhere. So it was really fantastic. Next book on my list is The Death of Vivek Oji by Akwaeke Emezi. Again, Emezi is a fantastic writer. This book, however, is extremely, extremely heavy, like a lot of Emezi's books actually, but in this story, the title tells us Vivek Oji dies. And we know that going into the story. And so without that kind of mystery, right, us knowing what will happen, the story still manages to be crafted in a way that makes you want to turn the page, figure out what's happening. It's the story of two boys growing up in Nigeria. And one of them is, well, they both have trouble fitting in. They're cousins, and so they end up having a close relationships because they're only sons, and so there's a lot of like family pressure and expectations put on them. The book is also about queerness in a society in which queerness is not accepted, is persecuted, what that means for the queer individual and for the family that maybe love this person but also understand the dangers, the daily dangers they face just by existing. And so it's really quite universal in a lot of its themes, and also specific in other ways to Nigeria. And I just, there's a lot of like homophobia, transphobia, violence, religious violence in this book. And if you can handle some of those themes, I think the story is so worth reading. And I think Emezi in this book really shows how much of a brilliant writer she is. Because again, every chapter, every so often we change point of views. We see the story from different point of views. And knowing what will happen, you still like are left wondering how it will happen, how some of these things are going to develop. And your heart is just crushed every time there's a new kind of revelation. And yet it's not, I don't know, I do think it offers a kind of hope in moments in the book. So I found it very worthwhile to read. Next book on my list is Bluebird by Attica Locke. This is a like thriller mystery, and I love reading mystery thrillers, and this one had an added layer that has a deep discussion of race in rural Texas. This is the story following a Black Texas Ranger. His family is one of the prominent Black families in this part of Texas, and so that gives him a sense of responsibility. The family feels a lot of responsibility towards the Black community in this area in terms of leadership, and also offering as much protection as possible. When we begin the story, our Black Texas Ranger is on leave from the Texas Rangers, so because of an incident that occurred. Little by little, we're told more about this incident, but everything he does in majority of the book is not under an official capacity as a Texas Ranger. His friend at one of the federal agencies asks him to look into something funky happening in one of these rural towns. There's a young white woman is dead and a Black man is also dead, and nobody's interested in investigating the death of the Black man, but it's clear that there's a relationship there. So he goes to this town, goes to like the local black diner, and begins unraveling what has been happening in this town for several generations in terms of racism and conflict within this community. I thought it was brilliant, just incredibly brilliant. And a lot of mystery thrillers I find can be quite repetitive, or like just very formulaic. I mean, mystery thrillers have to follow a formula, but Locke manages to bring in new depth into the genre, but through the lens of race, which I really appreciated. Next book on my list is At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop. This book is set during World War One, following one African character specifically, but the trauma that he has been dealing with since the loss of like his best friend. And so the story takes us, it kind of plays with time a little bit, going back and forth, because we go back to seeing why these soldiers enlisted to fight in the French army to begin with, and see further development from there. It's a short story, but it really packs a punch. It's a story of violence, of trauma, of race, it has so many layers, and it really is just a very short story. If I ever teach my history of violence course again, I want to use this book. I've been doing, whenever I teach the world wars, I do quite a bit on like racial conflict, on colonial troops being used by the British and the French in World War One, and then in World War Two, the experience of African American soldiers. And I think this story highlights so many of the themes that I like to touch on, and does it in an incredibly brilliant way. Just brilliant. It's hard for me to talk about the writing, because I just found it that it played with time really well. It played with like a sense of consciousness of the character we follow, because we're in his head for so much. The sense of consciousness really takes us through kind of the trauma, the journey of trauma that he is going through. Brilliant. And next on my list is A Man Called Ove by Fredrik Backman. I was crying through most of this book, and I think this is the only Fredrik Backman book I've ever read, and just judging by this one book alone, I can see why people love this writer so much. The book is set, I forgot where in Scandinavia, but you have this older man who is cleaning up his house when the neighbors move in, and this is like a grudgy old man. He's so mad at everyone and everything, and there's an order to things, and people aren't following the order. They're not doing the right thing, and he's yelling at the neighbors because they're trying to back up this like huge truck into a street where they're not even allowed to be. And slowly the neighbors, the family that moves in next door, just like starts bringing him out of his cave in the dark place he has been. Slowly though, every so often we kind of go back in time to see his story and how he became this grumpy old man, and you learn that, oh my goodness, yeah, he's had a hard life and he has a right to be grumpy. And you're like, you're not meaning to, but I just kept crying. I just kept crying and sobbing during the story. Now, full disclosure, I cry very easily when reading. But I think this is the book that made me cry the most in 2022. It was a fantastically wonderful story. I've seen the Scandinavian film adaptation of the book, which I really enjoyed. I know Tom Hanks is doing the American version of the movie, and I'll watch it, though I'm not sure if they can quite do justice to the story. Next book on my list is Cantoras by Carolina de Robertis. This is a book set during the dictatorship in Uruguay, I believe. And it's a group of women that are all queer. They're all queer, and they end up finding each other in in the middle of a dictatorship where queerness is being persecuted, where living their lives in a way that makes them happy is extremely dangerous, and yet they find this sisterhood together and an escape to a beach town together. I really loved it. There you have like a group of, I think it's 5 women, and each one is different. They're all like feeling the same pressure and persecution, but in very different ways. One is married, one is younger, and her family owns a store, so she has a little bit more flexibility. There's so much about the lives of women in Latin America that we get to see through the lives of this group of women in the middle of a dictatorship. I just really enjoyed it. Next is A Girl is a Body of Water by Jennifer Nashuga Makumba. This book follows a young woman who, through her life, and it's really interesting. It's a long book, so you get to follow somebody for quite a bit of time. And when we start the book, there's this kind of magical elements to it. The girl is experiencing something that she doesn't understand, but it could be a really fantastic thing that gives her power. But she doesn't want it. She doesn't want to be special in that way. She wants to be normal, and so she begins trying to achieve her goals and trying to find her own power without that magical element. She is being raised by her grandparents. She never knew her mother, and nobody gives her much information about her mother. Her father, however, is wealthy and eventually comes and gets her out of the village where she lives and brings her into the city, gives her access to a privileged education. And we get to follow her throughout that journey. That's what I really liked, is following one character through not the entirety of their life, but through a chunk of their life in a way that explores what girlhood, womanhood, relationships, romantic relationships, but also relationships like between father and daughter, or daughter and grandfather, grandmother, about small villages where women play an important role. I really loved it. I think for some people it's going to be maybe too much of a story, but I was really interested in the main character and all the relationships in her life, in the setting of Uganda. And so there was so much there to keep me like interested and to keep me reading. For some people that might be too much. There might be too much in there. At one point there's rebellions, there's political instability, and like death and sexual exploration. So a lot in there. But if you like these kinds of books, I think this is one you should give a shot to. Next on my list is Women Meeting by Claire Kohda. I really enjoyed this book. It's not for everybody because it's a vampire book set in the UK, in which you're following a young vampire who is part white, part Asian, and she hasn't had a lot of time to really explore what it means for her to have this Asian heritage, because her mother is somebody who kept her basically isolated. She never left her house except to go to school. It was like school, home, home, school, just back and forth. And her mother taught her to hate herself. And her mother saw vampirism as like a horrible thing because her mother had been really religious, and so she hates herself. But now her mother can no longer she can no longer take care of her mother. She's been taking care of her mother for a long time as her mother has deteriorated mentally, and now she is striking out on her own. She's renting an apartment, renting an art studio, exploring her artistic self at the same time that she's learning how to feed herself, like just feed herself, because she can't eat food as a vampire. She eats blood. So how will she attain food? The way she and her mother were attaining blood is no longer like that food source is cut off, so now she's having to figure things out on her own. And so it's just a lot of her walking through the city and trying to control her hunger and trying to decide who she is without her mother and while being a vampire. I found it really great. It is extremely slow paced though. There's not a whole lot of plot, not a lot happening. It's more of this journey of self-discovery that's very internal. So if you're a plot-driven reader, you might not want to pick this one up. But if you're into like really slow paced, really weird vampire stories, this might be a good one for you. It definitely was for me. And next on my list is a thriller, a historical thriller. It's called More Than You'll Ever Know by Katie Gutierrez. And this is another one of those books that I'm like, it's not going to be for everybody. But I absolutely loved it. It's set in the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. And you're following two different storylines. In one storyline, you are following a reporter who runs like a true crime blog. And she finds this story in the archives of this woman who was married to two different men. A murder occurs. One of the husbands kills the other, and the other ends up the one that supposedly killed the husband ends up in jail. And so she's just caught by this really interesting story. And then in the second time that we're following the story of the woman who had this double marriage, and so we go back to like the 80s and seeing her marry the men in her life and build two separate lives. It was really cool, but it's set in, I believe it's in Texas, because one of our main characters is a Mexican Latina woman in Texas, and she goes back and forth between Mexico and in the U.S. That's how she's able to have a double life. So there's that element of true crime. If you're into true crime stories, you're gonna like this one, even though this is entirely fiction. Because it's told in the style of a true crime story while being entirely fictional. And so you're following this reporter as she's unraveling the life of this woman in the present, but also getting to see the whole story from the point of view of this Mexican woman who led a double life. So it's a lot about womanhood, what it means to be happy, what it means to not be happy, how abuse affects the lives of women, and the relationships of women, not just with men, but with their children, with their mothers and fathers. I love this story. It stayed in my head. I want my mom to read it as soon as the book has been translated to Spanish, and I want to buy my mom the Spanish copy so that she can read it, because my mom's going to love it. My mom loves these kinds of stories. And plus it's partly set in Mexico. And you get to see, like, okay, there's this scene set in 1985, September 1985 in Mexico City. If you know your history, you know there was a big earthquake in Mexico City in September 1985. I know the date because it was exactly a month before I was born. And to see that, and like I've heard my parents talk about that. They weren't in Mexico City, but they were in Mexico, and they had felt this earthquake. And so getting to get this deeper perspective through this story like made me call up my parents and like ask them about their experience in Mexico during the earthquake. So it had a very interesting connection for me. It made me call up my parents. Okay, 2 books left, actually, just 2 books left. The next book on my list is Big Chicas Don't Cry by Annette Chavez Macias. Annette Chavez Macias also writes romances under the name Sabrina Soul, and I've been loving her writing there, but this story is different. This is women's fiction, which you're following this group of Latinx women in the U.S. as they just navigate their lives. So it's not a romance. You're not guaranteed a happily ever after for each of them. But seeing the complexity of their lives was really fantastic. Each chapter is told from the perspective of a different woman. And that part was incredibly brilliant, because sometimes that doesn't work, right? Sometimes you end up liking one character too much and getting like exasperated with the others or things like that. And I just felt like I was really into the lives of each of these characters, and like I was just there at for the journey, and I think that is a sign of a truly great writer. In addition, I knew I was gonna like this book right in page one because of the Spanglish. Latinos in the U.S. all have our different version of Spanglish, right? Bringing in wherever we're the Spanish of wherever we're from, which is always a little different, and I have never seen Spanglish used the way it is in Big Chicas Don't Cry. Like this is my Spanglish. It like in other books sometimes it feels forced, like they were feels like somebody told them you've got to sprinkle some Spanish in here, and this is not. This is true like Spanglish. In a way that really spoke to my heart, made me feel seen, and yet, if you don't speak Spanish, you're not going to miss out on anything. The contextual clues are all there. On top of it, these were all such interesting women. Like, they are all cousins that have been brought up to value family and to value their relationship with one another via their great grandmother. Well, their great grandmother can't hold them together as they grow up, and it's the death of the great grandmother that brings them all back together and helps them kind of work through some of the difficulty they're going through in their life. One of them is dealing with an unhappy marriage. Another is dealing with love, and well, they're all dealing with love in some way, but like fear of commitment. One is dealing with like shyness and being like afraid to initiate relationships. Another is dealing with racism at work. It's a lot of things that just felt very real, and like every character felt like very real, and I just felt some sort of connection to each of these characters. So I love this story. And I really think you should give it a try, because I think Annette Chavez Macias is severely underappreciated, and more people need to be reading her story. I just got approved for an ARC for her second women's fiction book, and I have very high expectations for it. So I'll let you know how that goes. Then last on my list here is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. Ooh, another really masterfully done book. If you like horror, but maybe if you're interested in horror but not deep, dark, gory horror, this might be the book for you. It's a mixture of Mexican Gothic and Rebecca. And just the premise alone tells you that. It's this Mexican woman whose father dies during the Mexican Revolution. He was a general who was betrayed by a different faction within the revolution. So he is killed and the family home is burned down. So it's set at the end of the Mexican Revolution. And she and the main character and her mother have to take refuge with the mother's family, who had disowned her mom because she married a man of a lower caste and darker skin. So living with the family members is not pleasant. They're basically treated like servants. So our main character gets the chance. She is proposed to by a wealthy hacendado, a man who belongs to a different faction of the Mexican Revolution than her father did, but who is offering her wealth and comfort. And she snaps it up. I mean, she talks about it. She talks about how, like, my parents' marriage was one of love, but I do not have the luxury of love. That decision, though, puts her at odds with her own mother, who does not approve of her not marrying for love and marrying for money. But she's like, no, she'll forgive me once I bring her to the hacienda, to the estate of my husband, which I will make my own. Well, okay. She's off to the hacienda. She arrives at her husband's large estate, and nothing is what it seems. This is a story about ghosts, about good versus evil, about the horrific decisions, the horrific pain that humans inflict. I love the discussion Cañas had here about religion versus popular magic, right? Like this is a time period in which after the Inquisition of kind of magical beliefs in Mexico. Like Catholicism really persecuted some of those indigenous beliefs. This is after the Mexican Revolution, so this people aren't being as persecuted, but there's still a lot of danger in believing in some of the magic that and indigenous beliefs. And you see that through the one of the side characters, a priest who is indigenous and also has been trained as a Catholic priest. And so it there's those layers there, but it's also just a really nice ghost story. So I I really liked it. Like this one, I think doesn't go as deep maybe as other horror stories good, but it's great for that because it's one like just this kind of fun horror story. I'm like, fun is the wrong word for it because, like, horror stories aren't fun. It's not fun. It's dealing with a lot of negative things, violence and fear, and all of those things. But it does it in a way that is not gory. It's not like it didn't give me nightmares, though your mileage will vary there because I feel like we all have a different threshold on how much we can handle with that. But I feel like I feel like this one is manageable. If you can manage Mexican Gothic, you can manage the Hacienda. Mexican Gothic is actually way more gory, I think, than the Hacienda. There is some gore here, some blood, some things happening because it's still a horror book, but I felt it was quite manageable and more manageable than like Mexican Gothic. Mexican Gothic, I think, Mexican Gothic got a little out of hand there, and I loved it for it, but I also loved the way the Hacienda did it. So those are it. Those are my favorite works of fiction I read in 2022. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know if you want to read any of these. Because if you do end up reading any of these, come back and talk to me about them. I love talking about each of these books clearly because I made this video long enough. But thank you if you stayed all the way to the end. Thank you for watching any part of this video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.